Analysis of what's happening now in Egypt. A man with long-time experience as a U.S. diplomat in the Middle East joins us, Edward Djerejian. He's the former U.S. ambassador. He's the director of the Baker Institute at Rice University in Texas. Mr. Ambassador, it is great to have you with us. What do you think when you see this happening on the streets of Egypt?
Well, this is obviously a momentous event in the most important single Arab country in the Middle East. As you well know, Jim, Egypt is the pillar of the Israeli-Arab peace treaties, the first country to sign a peace treaty with Israel in '79. It is the most populous Arab country. It controls the passages of the Suez Canal. It is a major player. What happens in Egypt will have an impact throughout the Arab world and the Middle East, and obviously vis-a-vis Israel. So when I see this, I see that what is coming to the fore is something that we've been dealing with ever since I've been in government and dealing with the Middle East for many decades, is this balance between stability and social, economic, and political justice. And that balance is now being really challenged in Egypt as we speak today. I think the remarks that you've announced that President Mubarak is going to make to the nation will be critical. Because the Egyptian government has not spoken to the Egyptian people and to the demonstrators. And this is a dangerous situation, but I think it's also an opportunity for President Mubarak to lay out that they're listening to the voices of the Egyptian people, that stability is important, that he is ready for a political transition, and that they are going to open up political and economic reforms. The presidential elections, Jim, are just later on this year. So that gives him an opportunity to maybe control the situation in a peaceful manner toward a transition toward political and economic reforms.
You know, we're just getting reports here, Mr. Ambassador, that Egypt's ruling party has its headquarters there in Cairo, and Egyptian news sources telling us now that those headquarters are on fire. A lot of rage in the Arab world. You have witnessed yourself all of the demands that people have had for governments that have been, frankly, well supported by the U.S. Egypt gets, what, $3 billion a year in aid, and some people think that the U.S., you know, clearly props up Hosni Mubarak as their ally.
Right. We have really not made the major transition since the end of the Cold War, Jim, where when the United States and the Soviet Union were vying for power in a bipolar world, we had our states, our friends, the Soviet Union had theirs, and certainly in Latin America, Africa, and especially the Middle East. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, a time came for more creative diplomacy, and especially in terms of supporting our friends and allies, not abandoning them, but urging them toward urgently needed political and economic and social reforms. Unfortunately, throughout both Democratic and Republican administrations, we've talked the talk, but we really haven't walked the walk.
The problem here, Mr. Ambassador, and I think you know this well, the problem is there's no viable political opposition. No real opposition has ever been allowed to thrive in a lot of these countries.
Well, that's correct, and that's why I'm saying, when I say walking the walk, is to urge these countries to do exactly that. Before you face a crisis like we're witnessing on your television cameras today in contacts with these various countries. But we really haven't made it a urgent issue in order to try to avoid. Now, having said that, it's not the United States alone or outside powers that are going to dictate what happens in these countries. This is in the hand of the countries and the people themselves.
Well, excuse me, Mr. Ambassador, I just want to point out to our viewers, they're looking at a live picture here that we have. This is ruling party headquarters ablaze in Cairo. And when you see that kind of anger, it's been one-party rule, hasn't it, Mr. Ambassador?
That's right. It's been one-party rule, and unfortunately, in the previous elections, I believe in 2005, the opposition, including the Muslim Brotherhood, got a number of seats, a good number of seats. In the last parliamentary elections, the opposition only got 3%, and that was a clear signal to the Egyptian body politic that these elections were truly not fair. and representative. And that's an added element of frustration along the lines I'm saying, that instead of moving forward, promoting political and economic and social reforms, there seems to be a regression in the other direction. And what happens as a result of what happened in Tunisia, it's spreading now to Egypt and to Yemen and other countries. People are just saying they've had enough.
What should we keep in mind? What thought should we keep in mind about the Middle East as we watch these images? We see this turmoil unfolding in a country as important as Egypt tonight, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, Jim, I think it's very important that in Washington we connect the dots. What happens in Egypt is going to have very important repercussions in terms of the Arab-Israeli context, in terms of what happens in other Arab countries. Egypt is simply too important a player. What happens in that country will have an impact throughout the region. So therefore, I think that it's important that what we do now is to try to do whatever we can, and it's limited, to try to assure a peaceful transition, political, economic, social, in Egypt, so that it does not become chaotic.
Do you think that President Hosni Mubarak has seen his last days in office?
I don't know. I'll tell you I don't think the situation can remain the same after what's happened in the last 2 days in Egypt. So I think there's definitely going to be a political transition. How that transition takes place, I do not know. But what he says today is going to be critically important. For example, is he going to say today that he will stand for elections in later on this year as president, or that he's going to open up the elections to free and fair elections and let the opposition parties and the secularists and people like Mohammed al-Baradi run? I don't know. But what he's going to say is going to have a critical impact on what follows. Now, remember, the military, as in many Arab countries in the past, as pillars of regime, may simply step in to establish a very uneasy calm. But even if that happens, the transition, I believe, is taking place.
Edward Djerejian, former U.S. diplomat, respected Middle East scholar, a man who has walked the walk through the Middle East. Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you very much for sharing our thoughts with our viewers around the world. We're continuing.
Good to be with you.
We're continuing.